You are live.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shantae Hill-Hammond, and I am the Designated Federal Officer, or DFO, for the Science Advisory Board BioSolids panel. In my role as DFO, I would like to formally open this public meeting and share a few administrative remarks. The SAB is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, also known as FACA. The SAB is empowered by the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, also known as ERDA, to provide advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical underpinnings of EPA's decisions. This panel and all committees of the SAB provide advice through the chartered SAB board. The SAB consists of special government employees appointed by the EPA to their positions. As government employees, all members are subject to the applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial interests or lack of impartiality of conflicts under ethics regulations specified in the Code of Regulations under Title V, Part 2535, relating to the topic of this meeting. FACA and EPA policy require that SAB meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and that substantive deliberations and interactions with the EPA and the public be conducted in open sessions where a DFO is present to ensure the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that public meetings provide an opportunity for oral and written public comment. There is a public comment period noted on the agenda for today's meeting. However, no members of the public have registered to present oral comments. 2 written comments were submitted to the SAB staff office for this meeting. They have been shared with the panel and are also available on the SAB website. This is the 3rd meeting of the BioSolids panel, and for today's meeting, the panel will review their draft report. The meeting is open to the public and accessible by telephone and webcast. To access the webcast link, please see the SAB website at www.epa.gov/SAB and then select upcoming meetings. Please note that all meeting materials, including the agenda, are also available on the SAB webpage. As members of the public are joining this meeting by telephone, I will ask that all speakers identify themselves prior to providing remarks. And if you are not speaking, please mute your microphones. Minutes will be prepared and certified as accurate by the panel chair to summarize discussions and action items in accordance with the requirements of FACA and posted to the SAB website. Finally, all participants are asked to acknowledge their attendance at today's meeting. Please send your name, email, and affiliation to me at hill-hammond.shante@epa.gov. Please note that my email address is provided on the SAB webpage for today's meeting. And with that, I would now like to turn the meeting over to the panel chair, Dr. Sylvie Brodeur.
Thank you, Shantae. All right, everybody. The first order of business is roll call, and then I'll make a few comments about what we hope to accomplish today, and then we'll dive right into discussing the draft report. So when I call your name, please unmute and say you're here, present, whatever. And in no particular order, I will start with Dr. Florence Onoro.
Here.
Thank you, Florence. Jennifer Arp.
Here.
Thank you. Lisa Camp.
Here.
Paul DeLeo.
Present.
Greg Kester.
Here.
Linda Lee.
Here.
Drew McAvoy.
Present.
Mike McFarland.
Here.
Ian Pepper.
Present.
And Jen Sommel.
Here.
Okay, and everybody has audio, which is fantastic. Okay, so today, this is our 3rd meeting, as Shantae said, and our goal today is to reach consensus on the report text. We will vote at the end of the meeting on whether or not we have achieved consensus, and our vote options include consensus with revision, and in that case, I would work with the lead to finalize the text agreed to in the meeting. So we have to raise the points in the meeting, and then I just work with the lead to finalize the revisions. And then I work with Shantae to prepare the report for the quality review of the full SAB. And the third option is non-consensus. And in that case, there is an option for an appendix to be created where the non-consensus or the dissenting view is articulated. I'm not sure whether we'll have that situation. It seems like most of the things that were from our initial meeting, there was a general agreement on most items, and that's what we're going for. But we do need to make sure that we state and address all the concerns and revisions today in this meeting, as we hope this is the last meeting of the group prior to forwarding it to the SAB. We can revisit the process going forward at the end of this meeting, but just as a heads up, once we incorporate revisions from today and it gets forwarded to the SAB appoints, the chair of the SAB appoints a small subgroup to lead up the full SAB review of our draft report, and their charge questions are basically to assess whether or not we have addressed the charge questions adequately, if there are things we've missed. If they are suggested revisions, that may very well come back to us to finalize, and depending on the nature of those revisions, we may be done and it gets forwarded to the administrator. You will note that there is one additional thing that we will need to be doing, and that is coming to consensus on some of the high-level points we want to raise to the administrator in the cover letter. That was left blank at this point in time. I think at this point, we'll move into discussion of the draft. And what I circulated and was posted about a week ago was just my sort of high-level read-through, or my read-through of the document. Greg, you have a question?
Yeah, just a process question as to what happens next, right? Does EPA need to do anything with the recommendations that we provide? Will we have a chance to see anything revised by EPA? Or
so the process is that EPA, we will forward our draft report to the administrator, and then that will be, EPA will have the opportunity to consider and respond in writing to, or make modifications or not to our report, and their comments will be available to us. But our process is essentially done at that point in time. Okay.
Thank you.
Somebody else. Okay, so we do have a relatively tight timeline. You can look at the agenda. Approximately 10 minutes have been assigned to each of the sub-questions. We have a little bit of flex because there are no public comments at this point in time. Also, you'll note that Shantae stuck in a couple 15-minute time slots. That's not because the sections need additional attention. It's just because we had an extra few minutes here and there, so we can get in an extra minute or two on a question, but we do need to pretty quickly come to sort of a consensus statements about the revisions that are needed, if any, the main points, etc. So I provided some written comments of things that I thought it needed clarification, and also a general overview that where we make assertions that we want EPA to consider things they have overlooked, we need to be comprehensive and provide a citation or two that directs them to, our supporting evidence for our assertions. And then we also need to make sure that the tiered recommendations clearly appear in the draft narrative of our response to the charge questions. In other words, we can't pull up a recommendation, a high-level recommendation that wasn't thoroughly vetted. They should go together. So occasionally there were things, and it was in part, a challenge, I understand, because there was so much overlap between questions. So where did things end up? Some of my comments, I went back and I looked as, okay, what did we really discuss about this question in my own handwritten notes? And that's where some thoughts came from. It doesn't mean it needs to be included. It means I noticed you didn't include it. So that's just an FYI as we move forward. So with that, we will launch right into
Dr. Berger, I'm so
yes.
sorry. Can I interrupt for one
Sure.
moment? I just wanted to share with our public that we also have a clarifying comments time slot on our agenda
okay,
at 3:30. If anyone is interested in providing clarifying comments, you will need to register by sending your name and affiliation to me by 2:30 today. Just wanted to add that for everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Shante.
Thank you.
That's for the general public. All right. Any questions before we launch right into discussing 1A or 211? You've got both numbers, I think, on the agenda. I have it on my agenda anyways. And this is not, let's open it to full discussion of the panel, thoughts, comments, needed revision. If the lead reviewer or anybody wants to leap right in, just go ahead. I will try to keep track of hands raised, that kind of thing, and also keep notes and watch the time. But with that, I open it up. I'm not going to read through all my particular concerns one by one. I just made note of them. I'm going to open up for you all to address comments and concerns. Florence, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I was gonna ask if is it possible to share each comment just so that it's easy rather than reading, so we can all see it and deliberate as we deliberate on it, if possible.
Just my comments or the text of the
text of the, yes, the text that will be deliberated on, yes.
Yeah, we do have the draft report. We can put that up for display.
Gotcha, got it, okay. Got it.
That would be helpful. So then as we're going through each of the section comments, we have the text upon which it, is directed in front of us.
Okay, Ian, go ahead.
So I was the lead on the question 1A, which is basically asking, is the PICS process appropriate and sufficient to identify chemicals and initiate the whole process? And the answer is, of course, yes, it is sufficient, provided the recommendations of the SAB are followed. So I think that's a really important point, and it's worrisome that if EPA doesn't agree with the recommendations, it's kind of a dead end for the SAP. There's nothing much they can do about it. So that's a big concern. I don't know if anyone wants to address that issue.
Well, I think I agree with Ian in the sense that, there was several, we discussed it in our previous meetings, and some of the comments that came in that if the process doesn't have off ramps that make sense specific to biosolids, you could end up with not doing a very good job of screening down to a subset of chemicals that may be of concern and need more detailed risk assessment. And since it's very labor intensive, we really want things to be done well at the front end and have appropriate off ramps to minimize what that list is that needs the focus. And so I think that's consistent with what Dr. Pepper's talking about, that we hope that that's really considered in our responses.
So following on what Belinda's saying, there are some critical points that are actually documented in the response to question 1A about things that EPA needs to consider to come up with relevant recommendations. So the one that I know many of us are concerned about is that is EPA going to take into account the matrix of the biosolid itself, meaning that straight chemicals in solution behave differently than chemicals bound within the biosolid matrix. Another example would be, and we asked this question at the last meeting and didn't really get an answer, are total or bioavailable concentrations of chemicals being utilized? That's a really critical factor. Are the concentrations current? Because they've changed over the past 20 years. So these are just a few examples. And I'd also like some input as to tier 1 recommendation that we have in response to question 1A is that if EPA is going to all this time and effort to identify and get all this information on many, many chemicals, could they then use that data to develop thresholds that would define whether a biosolid was municipal or industrially contaminated? I talked to Deputy Director of Pima County Wastewater about such an issue, and the response was very enthusiastic that it would be very helpful. And if you look at the literature, land application of biosolids is really only an issue when industrially contaminated biosolids are utilized. So being able to differentiate between the two would be incredibly important.
So there are a number of hands up. Just quickly, Ian, I have a question for you, because I made a comment that I wasn't quite clear what you wanted EPA to do in your tier 1 suggestion. It sounds to me when you're explaining this now is that if they do go through the process and they identify thresholds, then those thresholds should be made available. But is that a tier 1 activity or tier 2? Which comes first?
Well, I'd have to go and look at the definitions of tier 1 and tier 2. That basically sounds like semantics to me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm just raising the question. I wasn't quite sure. Greg, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. One is, I agree with Ian that I think a really overriding need is to ensure that the biosolids matrix is taken into account. The fact that behavior is very different for a pure chemical and water than it is within the biosolids matrix. And I think that could be one of the highlighted points to Administrator Reagan. The other question I had, and Drew McAvoy may speak to this, is the Water Research Foundation is doing their own project of prioritization right now using a different method than PICS, and just wondering if that's something that ought to be evaluated, or at least when results are derived, a comparison be made to see how the two different approaches compare. It might be very instructive to us, I think.
Yeah, and just to comment on that, if I can, I think the one thing that is really missing is mobility. And I think, you could add another SDM on mobility, and it's a matter of including soil absorption. So this takes into account the leaching down into the groundwater. So that could be a recommendation that we put forward.
Paul, you have your hand up.
Comment sort of reaffirming what others have been saying. And I think thematically, what we've said is, EPA is generally heading in the right direction, but they need to adapt some of the work here so that it's fit for purpose for biosolids. And I think, others have articulated some of the specifics on that. I also wanted to acknowledge Mike McFarland's comment. You had comments, Sylvie, but Mike did as well. And the one that resonated with me is that, we ought to be acknowledging, the work that EPA did. And even though we have a lot to say, the reality is there's a high level of, I think, general comfort with the direction they're heading, but we have a lot of specific details where we think there are opportunities to improve what they're doing. So just something sort of stylistically we should be focusing on in the final report.
And that may be a prefacing statement to the high level comments to the administrator as well.
Yeah, great.
Other questions or comments? I'm not.
I think my hand is up. I would also follow up with Dr. McFarland's comment about acknowledging EPA's work or concern about the biosolids and from a public perception and especially communities of color, there's a huge concern about PFAS and some of the chemicals of concern found in biosolids. And a lot of people don't know how much work that EPA have put into addressing those concerns, or at least finding a solution to classify and regulate these pollutants in biosolids. So highlighting that, in addition to them making recommendations as we attach to an SAB in general as to how it could be made better would be really helpful for the public at large. Thank you.
Additional comments? Okay, regarding tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, any questions on the recommendations? I think this was, yeah. Anybody? Nope. Drew, you're muted. If you're.
Yeah, just to follow up on my previous comment, because I don't think we discussed it previously, is making a recommendation, to include mobility in the assessment, including soil absorption to, look at mobility into the groundwater.
Drew, could you be a little more specific in terms of what you're thinking about in an additional recommendation there?
Yeah.
And where it would go, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3?
Oh, in terms of the tiers? I think it could go in the tier 2.
And what would that recommendation be?
The recommendation would be that they include an additional what do they call it? SDMs. Yeah, SDM to include mobility as one of the criteria, and that would involve assessing soil absorption.
So can I add a comment to that? So this is what you're recommending for like an SDM for the pick process.
Right.
So my one concern is, given the broad range of chemical types that we're talking about, chemical classes, that could be incredibly difficult to do at the PICS level. Because you have compounds that we cannot use the KOC concept like a lot of the other, prior to this suite of chemicals, things were a lot more straightforward. Most everything was driven by a KOC concept, and you could make certain assumptions about the changes in carbon content, in a profile. But I'm concerned that there are so many parameters that would have to be considered, from ionization, pH, exchange capacity, which isn't even considered, in addition to air water surface sorption for the class of PFASs. So I don't disagree that it would be nice to have that that is definitely needed at, that and other things are needed at a stronger level. I know, at least in the BST, but I'm just concerned. I mean, we can make a recommendation. I just don't know how well they're going to be able to implement that recommendation at this level for that many chemicals.
Well, there are ways to do it.
So then we would need to be very explicit in, if we're going to make that a recommendation at this stage, especially tier 2 versus maybe tier 3. Maybe this becomes a tier 3 if it's a bigger lift. Paul.
Yeah, I guess my concern is that EPA would use an overly simplified approach to mobility. The Europeans, I think they're looking at the mobility of the chemical without considering the matrix in certain assessments, and it's based on low, I think, log KOW and water solubility. And so you could screen things pretty quickly that way, but it's not going to reflect the true mobility of the chemical in the biosolids matrix and then in the particular soil for which it's amended. So to Sylvie's point, it may be that we have to be more specific, and it's a little bit more of a research project than something that's quickly actionable, unless you have examples that are something they'd be able to adapt relatively quickly, Drew.
Well, I mean, neutral species is pretty simple. You can come up with a KOC. If it ionizes, then it gets a little bit more complicated. But again, that's why I said a tier 2 recommendation. So they'd have to look into, and that, and talking about ionization, that comes up again and again and again. So they're going to need to think about how to model those compounds anyway.
The bulk of the compounds that are before us actually fall into this much more complicated area, ionization or, other things like, attenuation at the air-water interface. So, I mean, maybe it gets, but we can definitely make a recommendation that somehow they can consider attenuation, but then it also begs for biodegradation, that's not considered. So, which is directly relevant to biosolid applied fields, because biosolids really enhance the whole microbial population and biodegradation. So I guess we have to step back and think about where should we ask for extra layers of nuances that we know are really important. Can they be handled in the first level screening, like the PICS process? I know, Drew, you think they can, so we'll have to. Like Sylvie said, be explicit.
I have a comment that if we're going to make a recommendation on mobility, that the biosolid matrix absolutely has to be part of that recommendation. So I can give you a very specific example. We looked at and published papers on viruses leaching. And if you look at viruses leaching from biosolids and compare it to leaching of viruses in pure solution, totally different. The viruses are absorbed and don't move anywhere near as much as in free solution. So that's a critically important point. But you're going to come up with the wrong answer if you don't take that into account.
Okay, Greg, and then we need to move on to the next question. So we need to have some sort of idea about what revision. So Greg, go ahead. You're muted, Greg.
Thank you. I would recommend as a tier one recommendation to ensure that the biosolids matrix is considered as opposed to pure chemical in solution. Somehow get that worded in there. And the other issue in terms of what Drew was just talking about, maybe as an alternative, if it is too complicated, we could at least put in a recommendation that they compare their results with what the Water Research Foundation process comes up with. That'd be sort of a way to just ground truth it.
Sylvia, I have a question. Who will, so it sounds like we want another recommendation. Am I responsible for writing that recommendation, or how does this work?
Well, you can solicit your team to help you craft the recommendation, but I need to get it from you as the team lead.
Okay, so I can put out like a draft recommendation, run it through the group, and then go from there.
Yeah, I think Shante will return and revisit how we can communicate, but with keeping the, acknowledging the FACA requirements. But yes, you need to, yeah. Other comments on this question? So what I'm hearing is that we need some revisions. We need to specifically have a tier one rec concerning the matrix. And I'm not quite sure what we're saying about attenuation, but perhaps a way to get around this is to discuss cross-referencing, mention that the other activity that's ongoing, and cross-referencing of outputs from the two processes. Is that correct?
Yes, but one thing we we're so busy trying to come up with another SDM that we didn't really talk about the ones that are listed. And some of them do relate specifically to the fact that the biosolid matrix has to come in, has to be an important consideration. But specifically, like with the skin sensitization, skin and eye irritation, we've discussed this before. Is that really a viable SDM to have in the screening? Maybe it's viable for a biosolids applicator, but not really and I'm even question that, but maybe not relevant. And then I think the other one was the weighting of SDMs that, again, the biosolid matrix should be considered in how SDMs are weighted. So again, both of those come back into why we would want a tier one assessment that the biosolid, or recommendation that the biosolid matrix is considered. But like you said, Dr. Bruder, that we should specifically be able to say, give examples. And so those would be examples that we would include in that.
So this is a modification or expansion of the text to be more specific regarding the biosolid matrix and the SDMs.
Yes.
Okay.
And those were also recommendations by NACWA. So it supports what they were discussing.
Okay. All right. Are we clear now on that, what we're thinking of doing there? I see Ian nodding. All right. Moving right along, let's go to the implementation consideration. And this one, I think we need to, I put down, some of the thoughts that were in my comments, things that were considered in the discussion. And again, there is some potential overlap, but the need to acknowledge inherent bias in the process and awareness of the PICS process itself to the weighting and the metrics versus just summing. I'm not sure whether this goes in here or not, but I think this is, we need to be a little bit more specific here. And then right now, there are no tiered recommendations here. And if we actually have no tiered recommendations, that's okay. But we need to say no tiered recommendations. Or if we just didn't get around to them, that's a separate thing. Linda, you have your hand up, so go take it away.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if this is also where some of the either off-ramping, so additional steps that EPA should consider when they're prioritizing. So we've mentioned this in our meetings and just where it all fits into, but in addition to what we've already discussed in terms of weighting, are the chemicals, again, found in background levels, so background levels versus what's in the biosolids. Secondly, chemicals that we have, like our pharmaceuticals, we take so much in. And so if the concentrations in the biosolids are lower than what are ingested by humans by choice, how are we weighting that? So if the concentrations are lower in the biosolids than what we ingest, it seems like those kinds of things should also be included. It maybe in additional steps that EPA should consider in the prioritization process. So, and then I think this also gets to, and can't figure out where everything follows in all these recommendations, but when up front decide whether a chemical, as a next step before you get into the detailed risk assessment, is the chemical really a hazard to humans or is it more a hazard to ecologicals? And I bring that up now because I mentioned pharmaceuticals. So pharmaceuticals, there might not be a hazard to humans because they take, 10 to the 6 times higher concentrations than would ever be exposed to from biosolids application, but runoff into streams might affect aquatics. So at that point, your decision on prioritization should only be including the ecological risk assessment and not the human health risk assessment. So I feel like those are all, I think those would fit here under additional steps that EPA should consider,
Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up one point as we're talking about these chemicals. For a utility, I mean, we have a very important tool that we use all the time to keep certain amounts of certain chemicals out of the waste stream, and that's our industrial pretreatment program. I can't imagine any utility of any size just willfully ignoring industrial contributions to the waste stream. First of all, a wastewater utility plant is only designed for a certain amount of loading for a whole host of things, BOD typically being one of the primary drivers. And so for us, and I'll speak on my utility, but chemicals of all kinds of nature, especially those with an ecological impact, are going to be limited in the waste stream through an industrial pretreatment program. So its goal in the industrial pretreatment program is to get the waste stream as close to domestic sewage strength as you possibly can. And no utility is really going to be willy-nilly about that. Just something to think about.
Can I comment on that, Sylvie?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, because I want to echo what Jennifer has said. By regulation, these utilities have to remove a number of chemicals before they discharge into the local sewer, and so they're highly regulated under Part 403 of the Clean Water Act, and so it's going to be hard to differentiate a residential biosolids material versus an industrial biosolids material because they're commingled. But on the side of the utility, they oftentimes their discharge permit is actually driven by biosolids quality. So there are heavy metals and so forth in the 9 heavy metals that are in land applied biosolids. These industries, these utilities rather, are limited into what they could discharge to the headworks because it's going to affect ultimately affect what they can do with their biosolids. So just want to echo what Jennifer said, because that's across the country, not just Georgia.
All right, anyone else got some comments on this? So what I'm hearing is that the text needs a bit of nuancing and refinement to point out some very specific concerns. And then with that go tiered recommendations. I had one from Linda that this would be where one specifically considered sort of parsing out ecological from human health risk. And I'm not sure what else I had in terms of tiered recommendations. That other than just sort of generically other off-ramping considerations, but does someone have a more articulate thought than that on this?
If you wanted to include some language for the tiers, in addition to what Linda recommended, you could also suggest that maybe as tier 2, that EPA balance these 700 chemicals with the existing industrial pretreatment guidelines.
Okay, so you have 700 the EPA reconcile the chemicals list with the existing existing guidelines, pretreatment guidelines that for utilities.
Yeah, industrial pretreatment guidelines.
Lisa?
Just a quick question, and I think I also agree with everything Jennifer's saying. It makes a lot of sense, and it does seem to be very standard across the country. But for the list of 700, are they basing this on the concentrations that they have actually documented in biosolids post any of this kind of treatment or not? I guess maybe I'm a little confused about the genesis of the 700
of the 700 to start out with.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I can answer that question off the top of my head.
Does anybody know?
Yeah, my understanding is that it comes from the various sewage sludge surveys, starting in 1988, and then the 2 subsequent ones, where in 1988 they had probably a lot more than 700, and as they've gone on with the implementation of pre-treatment, a lot of those chemicals have come out of the biosolids. But at the end, where we're at right now, I guess they have 700 that they're concerned about. So it's actually in the sewage sludge from whatever facilities they monitored.
Yeah. Okay, that rings about. Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So I just vis-a-vis Jennifer's comment. So are these things they're still finding allegedly post this pre-treatment?
So yes, but
Okay.
finding a chemical in biosolids that they never gave a threshold limit. So because it's in there doesn't mean that it's over the threshold limit that your industrial pretreatment or any industrial pretreatment program would have. My understanding was more of it was presence absence related rather than concentration related.
Right. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just offer that these are chemicals that were found at least once, in my understanding, through the variety of surveys and analyses. So, but we should also notice with the pre-treatment program, admitting that that is made it, it's been such a successful program. But it is important to note that many of the 700 probably are not included in the pre-treatment program. You pretty much have to be a categorical pollutant in order to be included there. So there are many of these which may not fall under that umbrella. Which is
Okay,
why-
we need Drew and then Greg, and then we need to come to consensus and move on.
Yeah, it's my understanding that there's only one SDM that includes exposure, and that's the human health to exposure ratio that they use. And the exposure, I think, is predicted. They're using the EPA Expo CAST model to predict exposure. So I don't think they're actually using any measured data.
Okay, did someone have a last comment? All right, so for this, I heard there's Linda's recommendation for, I think, a tier 1, and then a tier 2 about balancing or cross-referencing the 700 chemicals with existing industrial pretreatment guidelines. That may actually have some limitations because not all chemicals may be within those guidelines, but it could still be a cut, is my understanding from the discussion. It could still be an important way to refocus and cut. Linda? You're muted.
Sorry, I know we have to hurry on this one, but I wonder if this is where it comes in for like the pharmaceuticals, if the concentrations in the biosolids are much lower than what people would take by a prescription, then then we're not really doing a human health assessment, but then it still could be ecological. So maybe it doesn't fit as this extra step here. I guess I'm thinking out loud. So anybody want to add to that? My thought.
I mean, so two things. I mean, if something's nutritionally required too, like it's a dietary nutrient, some of the, metals and things like that, calcium, I don't know all 700, but there's like when you're doing a human health risk assessment for, under EPA, you can consider things like what are the levels versus what we're required to have as part of our diet, like a RDA. So, I mean, maybe that's captured by that HERS ratio, but maybe it's not. I don't know enough about it, but I would think something like that, things that are required nutritionally. Again, that's sort of separate from the eco issues. If the levels that they're finding in biosolids or it's basically an inert thing, I wonder if there's a way it could be screened out from the get-go, but maybe.
I think what I hear you saying is that there's a need to have a balanced, again, to have a check process where we're not inadvertently identifying things that are spurious to health, right? So that's again this process of don't check your brain at the door and just go with the model. Put much more nicely, use existing knowledge. Florence, and then we got to move on. Florence, go ahead.
I just want to know we have a few, maybe a minute or two. I would also like to add that for the 700 chemicals that everyone is talking about, it would be advisable, recommended that they be classified based on the level of toxicity. She talked about the ones that are nutritionally found, and of course the pharmaceutical ones. And those that are highly toxic and have known or at least potential human health hazards, those could be removed from the presence/absent type of classification. and use some other type of index, because the presence or absence really allows it to, it's kind of vague. So maybe coming up with a sort of classification system where the less adverse or potentially hazardous ones would be classified differently, and then the others separated from that 700 list. That was my recommendation.
Okay. All right, so some revisions needed here on this one, and then the articulation of those tiered recommendations. And Florence, I made some notes, but you can work with your team and I'll work with you to get that text drafted, okay?
Sure. All right.
All right, moving on. We are now, I guess, on to the 2.2s. And that is starting with the deterministic level screening, the selection process. And yeah, comments. And I thought it was pretty easy to understand. I thought we could probably strengthen our discussion with some referencing, that kinds of thing. But other comments? I can't remember whether Greg, you had a additional comment on this one. Yeah. So 221, Greg, you noted that many biological receptors are potentially eradicated from whatever.
Yeah, that's right. Just, just as a thought, insecticides, rodenticides, herbicides are all used with the intentional purpose of eradicating a lot of ecological receptors. So just wondering how that plays into it and whether that ought to be in consideration.
Other questions, comments? I had a question on whether or not, I think this is 221. Hang on, I gotta get up there. Hang on. On the last paragraph. Of that text before the tiering recommendation, whether that last paragraph needed further clarification or whether the team was good with that statement.
So the one about the higher IAM.
Yeah, that one, Linda.
Yeah, so more data resulted in a higher IAM or a high, yeah. Jennifer, do you have or Lisa? So it is also noted that there seems to be a need to consider the IAM human health concern bias. That is, chemicals with a higher IAM tend to have a higher health environmental impact concern, specifically for chemicals found in biosolids, and the potential that data availability or lack thereof may bias the screening level analysis.
Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think this was my original comment in the write-up that we did initially. And this is something that's also noted in it's either the guidance document or the white paper. It actually might be the white paper, that there is a known effect that this will happen. And so I wanted to just call it out here because while they've noted it in the white paper, EPA has noted it in the white paper, I didn't see anything sort of to take that into account in terms of the process. So I could, while we're talking, try to pull that up in the white paper and see if there's anything more in terms of the detail there, but that was directly from EPA's own note about their concern about this issue.
Oh, okay, so can we be a little like more specific and say, you know, the EPA notes that, you know, this is a concern and cite that reference, cite their white paper, but then it's not apparent what they're going to do about it.
Right.
Absolutely. That makes sense to me. And Linda, I can get that to you if it's helpful.
Yeah, no, I remember all the figures. They actually even had figures in there where they showed some things. So, I mean, they actually did quite a bit of effort to evaluate that. So I think, Sylvie, you hit it right on. Acknowledge that EPA noted this. They actually, you know, did some data synthesis to show it. But as you said, it wasn't clear that how they would address it or how that would continue, you know, how that would be used to affect the screening level. You know, what makes the shorter list.
Right. Okay, Lisa, you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, but I agree with that paragraph, but I don't think that's a problem. I mean, I think you're making a statement. But I think it does make sense that things that we tend to be more concerned about have more data and study on them. So it's part and parcel. And I think those are the things we should probably be focusing on, right? Similar to what we just discussed previously, like things that are required for part of our diet or generally like non-toxic. We don't want to be focusing on those things because they're not going to be having, impacts, adverse impacts. So I agree that it's true, but I don't think it's a problem, I guess.
Well, I guess I can understand, and then back to you, Jen, but I can understand that something may not have a lot of data on it because we haven't thought we were going to be, exposed to it. And now, okay, now we're saying we may be being exposed to it, but we still don't have any data. So we haven't known to be didn't know to be concerned yet. Go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, no, I think, Sylvie, that's exactly it. So Lisa, I would agree with you that for the types of concerns where we do have a lot of data, that's absolutely true. I think it's the opposite where we want to make sure that we raise the issue, because where there's little data, there tends to be this bias towards a lower concern, whether or not that's true or not. And so I think that's the case we want to maybe address or highlight here.
Right, but they're not going to be able to be evaluated in a risk assessment anyway, because then they're also not going to have toxicity information. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, so yeah, we can point it out, we can bring it in, but we're not going to be able to quantify things in the BST, et cetera, necessarily, because if there's not good information on, the pathway, that chemical toxicity studies, it's not going to be able to be, quantitatively evaluated. So I think it's fine. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I just think, it's going to drop out at that point anyway, because if there's no data, there's no data,
Right. And I guess that's the question is, should it be screened out based on whatever the arbitrary, and it's not arbitrary at all, of course, but whatever the screening level considerations are, if that's what all there is to screen it out and it gets screened out inappropriately, I guess that's the only question I had. You're right. I think it'd be a pretty unusual case, but it just seems like the bias is something.
I think what you're saying is what happens to things that are screened out that shouldn't be screened out just because they don't have data going with them. And so where does that go? Does that go into some other box that then prioritize kind of the collection of data? How do we?
So wouldn't that be a tier 3? I mean, so like a TBI. So, some things that we hadn't really considered in the past that just don't have a lot of data availability. It doesn't mean that they might not be a problem. It just means we can't evaluate them now. So that maybe those are the types of things that we would recommend for further study or like to be tested. Or
would they make it to tier 3? I guess is my question with the current system at all. Would they even make it there?
I don't know, because there's other things besides, that's only one of the parameters in PICS, right?
True, absolutely.
So I think it's unclear. I don't know. I don't know, Sylvie, is that, you know, like, so to just to capture the fact that there's uncertainty and that some of those things maybe, you know, should be assessed or should be a focus of future data collection. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's fine to say that. I think you know, what's their process for not forgetting stuff that should be not forgotten? I
Right.
think is
Yeah, that's kind of what we're saying.
Yeah.
Ben's
Exactly.
point. What's
That's
the
right.
process?
Okay.
So, you know, I think an articulation of that is probably fine.
I
Any other,
totally agree. Yeah.
so Linda, you know what you guys are doing on this section? I think you're in charge of this section. Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts here that if not? So there was maybe it's a tier 3 or whatever, but, and a little modification of text, some referencing. All right. Are we ready to move on to BST receptors? Yep. Okay. BST receptors. Lisa, that's.
Yep.
what you led.
So yeah, I think your first comment was, is there a specific set of EPA guidelines for ecological risk assessment? And I think Paul, you know, I referenced your comment here about the population and community level. And then referenced that further question response 2.2.5. Is that what you were referencing, Sylvie, or am I confused?
I'm just asking what is being cited if you look at page 8.
Yeah, she has.
And then Paul, you had your hand up, but if you look at page 8, line 26, 27, is this a particular guideline or, you know,
What-
what do you, where would you go?
I believe
to
it's,
see how
yeah,
they
it would
do
be,
this?
I totally agree at that point. We need to cite that. And I think EPA's guidance on ecological risk assessment would be, you know, like a key source to cite in that case. But I mean, that goes to problem formulation.
Yeah.
It's essentially where, but it's common practice, but I think it would be part of, that would be the site, probably the key citation, but I can
Okay,
confirm that.
okay. That's a prime example of strengthening our,
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
you know, our text there is just, you know, saying this is the reference that we need to get in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Your statement on it was kind of a mouthful, line 8 through 13 on the it's like, can we parse that out a little bit? Because
Yeah, we can. I've already
Okay.
started like editing it a little bit.
Okay, because it's the
And-
crux of many discussions, right?
know.
That we're saying this unit does everything they could possibly do to roll in biosolids 24/7 for their entire lifespan.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that just doesn't seem to be probable.
Right. And so, yeah, I think I can break it up into a couple sentences, Sylvie.
Okay,
And then also, I actually just found something that I think I can cite. It's kind of an archive document from 2005 from Office of Solid Waste, Center for Combustion Science and Engineering. It's an EPA Region 6 document. And it talks about a farm exposure scenario. And it's not apples to apples, but it's conceptually. So trying to parse apart some of the things they talk about here in terms of pathways. It specifically describes things like that only a portion of a farmer's diet should come from the homegrown, you know, food types. And it talks about, so it says things, it's, you know, that, so I think that's helpful. And that it also talks about that they really were only considering ingestion of drinking water for the farmer scenario if it was a surface water source
Okay,
versus a groundwater source. And then they specifically said, we don't usually recommend the ingestion of fish exposure pathway for the farm exposure scenario. So I was like, yay, I actually found something that says that explicitly. So I'm gonna add a citation to this.
okay, okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
Greg, you had a comment?
No.
Oh, I guess just looking
I had
your,
a quick comment, Sylvie,
Oh,
just
Paul,
that
go ahead.
I thought Lisa did a nice job of characterizing that distinction between the maximally exposed individual and reasonable maximum exposure. And that's something I think we've thematically touched on throughout in terms of our concern of compounding conservatism. I really like that terminology, the reasonable maximum exposure, and just from a consistency standpoint, trying to use that terminology throughout. I'm thinking of the section that follows is one of mine, where there's an opportunity to tweak that so that, again, we're consistent in our terminology.
okay, right, yeah.
And
Just in terms of putting this together, Shantae and I, we tried to be true to what you were putting in, but now this thing about internal referencing, internal
Right.
consistency, now's our opportunity to, look at each other's and say, okay, we can clean this up. Any other thoughts and comments on that?
I did think it was interesting that both sets of external comments we received also, kind of echoed some of the same concepts.
Right, and I think that may be a concern that gets elevated to the letter,
I was just gonna say that, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, the cover letter, Sylvie.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And
Other
then-
thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
And then I think just also for the tier 2, maybe do people have other things? I just wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying and I could try and articulate what I was trying to get at. So the only point I was making for the tier 2 was for the sewage sludge disposal scenario that they called it in the framework and in the model. They just kept calling the receptor group the child adult farmer. Whereas for the sewage sludge disposal scenario, it was really just an abutter. You know what I'm saying? So
Say it again.
it was really just an abutter, like a resident that happened to be living near it. So that's why I was saying, I'm not clear that, and I think it's actually confusing that they were calling that receptor still a child adult farmer for the people living next to the sewage sludge disposal area. And so that's why I was trying to make a recommendation to
okay. Somehow that point was lost on me.
Yeah, maybe I should. I thought yeah, well, if you were confused, maybe, I don't know, maybe I should make it clearer, but I thought
Okay, so that's actually all right. Okay.
Yeah, it was only for the sewage sludge disposal scenario.
Okay.
That's a good point.
Okay, so that nomenclature, that specifically has to do with child adult farmer versus a butter.
Right, yeah, and they just kept calling every, receptor group the farmer, and I wasn't clear. I mean, it's only a couple of pathways. They have nothing to do with farming.
Okay, all right, I understand now. But maybe a little tweak to clarify that you're,
Okay.
that's the direct reference. So Drew, go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe a tier 3, since it appears you don't really have one. It's something that kind of got buried. So this is on page 9, lines 35 and 36, where you're talking about, having a more logical guidance on selecting receptor scenarios. I think this is important, and they should provide a little bit more guidance on which ones to select, and that could become a tier 3 recommendation.
So, let's see. So adding as a tier 3, something along the lines for providing a more robust description of the conceptual site model they use to develop the scenarios, or
I
something?
guess I'm more interested in the receptors. And this would be more terrestrial on the eco side.
Oh, on the eco side, okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to, so can you articulate for me what you?
Well, I had discussed this the last meeting where, if you think about it logically, you got the soil contamination that the worm, eats the soil and gets contaminated, and then the bird eats the worm and up the chain it goes. So just having some guidance and language in the document on selection of those receptors.
Providing, some additional guidance and language on the selection of the terrestrial ecological receptors included in the model.
Yes.
Okay. Would provide additional helpful clarification. Okay. I can add something like that. And Sylvie, you and Shantae will review whatever.
Yeah,
little-
I'm making all these notes and
Okay.
we'll review, and I'll be back at you with questions if I
right.
get it, okay?
Yep, sounds good.
All right, then are we done with receptors? Okay. Then let's move on to the screening parameters.
Yeah, you had two comments there, Sylvie, and I think
Yeah.
I can speak to
One of
those.
them with typos, sorry about that.
No, I think it's a good point. I think in terms of your comment on the subsistence family farm, again, Lisa's got some thoughts on that, and I think I'll make sure we align. But the point there, the part that's missing is that, again, in the theme of compounding conservative, is you have this very small, community of subsistence farmers, and then you put high-end distributions on top of them. That's the part that's missing. It should be central that's why we're making the recommendation that for their central tendency. So that's the piece that's missing there.
Okay.
But again, aligning with what Lisa's gonna, if she has modifications on that theme, I think that's important to take care of. And then you made a comment about the first and third tier one comments, and you are correct. It's because the first comment is overarching that central tendency parameters should be applied for the subsistence farm family. And the third one is for the specific case of tenure, which would be covered among those. So it wouldn't need to, it wouldn't need to be called out, but what I could do is just say including.
Yeah, that might
tenure.
be better, right? That
On-
might be better, yeah.
Yeah, on the first one. And I wanted to point out one correction that needs to be made under the tier 2. The first bullet speaks to the recreational angler and the Native American fisher scenario, and that's actually talked about in the tier 3. What I meant to cite here was, again, something that Lisa had commented on back on page, well, it might be page 12. It's bottom of page 11 of mine. It might be top of page 12 on adult farmer fish consumption and the fact that they are not using the recommended trophic level 3 and 4 fish consumption. And so I need to tweak that. So that comment is about substituting the current consumption rate with one that's appropriate based on the guidance that's cited. And so it goes from, just to close the loop on that. It goes from 22 grams, in this case, the recommendation is going from 22 grams to 13.7 grams by virtue of the guidance.
Okay. Other questions, comments, discussion points on this one? Raise your hand or just speak out. Okay.
Yeah, just,
Okay, go ahead, Greg.
yeah, just real quickly, somewhere, I'm not sure if this is the right place, and I think we do note it somewhere, but the fact of, that so little biosolids application is used for human consumption food crops. It seems like it ought to be, highlighted somewhere. So little, we have EPA's own citations estimate less than 1% of all ag land uses biosolids. And of that, a very, very small, imperceivable really percent is used for human food consumption. So somewhere that perhaps comes in as a, another ground truthing element.
I'm not sure where
Yeah.
it's best to put that. I think
I'm
it's
not
a really
sure.
important statement that, that is a framing consideration, right? To the advice that we give to avoid compounding conservatism, blah, blah, blah.
Right. And I'm not sure either. I'll look at that again.
Okay. I mean, again, we want to be very clear what we highlight in the letter to the administrator, but again, it might be a point that we say, okay, look, we're concerned about compounding conservatism because, in part because, yes, go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, could we even just add that to the letter? Is it like a high enough level sort of overarching thought that we could just put it there with this compounding conservatism? I don't know if that's allowed without mentioning it explicitly in the other parts of the document, but that's just a thought.
As a framing consideration to our concerns.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah.
I think the question is, do we have to also include additional detail in the recommendation document?
If it, I think again, it can be, it could be in an introductory statement. Right now, we really don't have an introductory.
Yeah, so part of the challenge is it didn't come up in the charge questions. It's
Right.
Something that came from us, and so it's hard to be true to the charge questions, even though it's this theme that runs throughout most of our commenting. So,
Yeah,
I would, if to the extent that we would have again an introductory paragraph on that section 2 on the deterministic assessment, I think that's where I would put it. Again, with as a framing consideration.
Okay.
sounds good.
All right. I've made a note that we need to have a 2.2 sort of framing consideration statement. All right. Any other comments on this right now? On 2, whatever we're on. 2C. Okay. And then the last one before we take a quick break is on the geographic exposure pathways. I didn't have any specific comments when I was initially writing this up, but then after, in the past few days, I was thinking about this just in terms of, it isn't just the, which is more representative of precip or, mean annual precip or whatever. I think it also has to do with like precipitation in the context of of growing a crop. And so I wondered whether that would modify it, whether, you know, if precipitation is not, you know, captured or retained or whatever and useful for another part of the year. And because the suggestion was to move it to
Omaha,
Omaha. And I
Yeah.
don't know anything about Omaha's precipitation distribution. I just know that once you get west of Omaha, you get into a lot of irrigation.
Yeah.
So that's my only,
Well, I think that's somewhat covered in the tier 2 recommendation, in that, you know, they don't really explain how the different locations are utilized, the data from them, you know, and that includes the rainfall frequency and duration and intensity, because
okay,
that's really a critical piece. So that's what we're recommending, that they explain that better.
okay. And you're the lead on this one, Greg, is that right? Yeah?
Yes,
I'm gonna lose track of stuff. Okay.
yeah. And Omaha was just much closer to the national average. It's almost right on, where Chicago is fairly above it.
Right, and hang on, I'm trying to find the overall. So one, is that clear in the sort of narrative that we're making this recommendation, but in part, we're limited in our ability to make a more informed recommendation because we don't know how they're gonna use it, right?
That's right.
Okay, is that? Yeah, okay.
Maybe that tier 2 recommendation really ought to be a tier 1.
To clarify it, right?
Yeah,
I say Omaha, okay.
you know, and the parent soil material is similar in Omaha to Chicago as well.
Okay, okay. Well, I mean, I think we can recommend it, but because we simply don't, you know, but we need maybe a clarifying statement that we don't, we're hamstrung a little bit by the fact that we don't know how it's going to be. It needs a better explanation, and then that's the recommendation.
Yes.
Okay,
So I mean, I guess that I would say we could make both those recommendations tier 1.
okay. Other thoughts and comments on this geographic siting thing? All right, we're staying in good time here, which means we'll have some time to go over if we keep it up, but to go back and discuss some additional things. I saw somebody put something in the chat, but I assume okay. All right, that goes back a while. Sometimes I don't always follow the chat. All right. Do you all want to take a short break? Take a short break now?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. We are at 2:25. So let's break until well, it depends on how efficient we're going to be with the rest, but you can let's try to be back 10 minutes longest. So be back here by 2:35, ready to go, starting discussion on the next. Okay.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thanks.
Alrighty.
Hello? Yeah. Yes, Dan.
Ian, you want
Hang on.
Shantae, are you back? All right, we're back. Shantae, did anybody register for clarifying comments?
No.
Okay, so nobody registered. Nobody's gonna come on. Great. All right, I think we are on 2E or 2.2.5, which is on the exposure pathways. And Shantae, I put in a couple notes directed more towards you, but on lifting figures out when we want to talk about the figures, to me that seems like it would be helpful rather than people having to go back to try to figure out what pathway 3, 12, and 15 are. So I assume that's all right. And then also, internal referencing is helpful, at least my perception when in reading these documents, because people say, didn't they already make that suggestion or whatever, or that comment where we're reiterating. So I don't know if Shantae, if you have any specific comments for guidance there or no.
No, just to say that, if it's appropriate for us to reference specific figures in the white paper, we can certainly do that and incorporate them.
Okay, all right, thanks. All right, so the I think most of mine were on, can we cite examples for dermal exposure, some of the assertions that we made.
Yeah, and that's Jennifer Sommel. I think if you could help with that, that would be a great help.
Which one are we at? Sorry, that we're
Sorry,
looking at.
we're on the exposure pathways thing.
Yep.
And there's
that first section
ahead,
on the dermal exposure, Sylvie suggested that we include citations with respect to some of those points where data are available or examples that are relevant.
Yes, agreed. Okay. Yeah, let me take a look at that. I had read this, but not with an eye for that specific question. So Sylvie, I can provide you with some citations.
Okay, I think it's helpful when we say, this is out there, folks. We want to be pretty directional if we're saying you should be looking at this.
Totally agree. And I did try to do that in section, I think, 3.2 as well. Okay. So there are some references there, but let's add them here. I think that's a really good idea.
Even if it's the same reference, it doesn't matter. You're just saying, okay, this goes with this assertion.
I agree. Okay.
So Sylvia, I want to make one comment here because it's
go ahead.
Just to raise it to the group. With the tier 1 recommendation here for ecological risk assessment is basically they need to go back to the drawing board. It's the second item under because the first one is on human, the second one's on the eco. So this is a pretty
are not appropriate ecosystems
for ecological risk assessment. There's a pretty significant comment, and I think folks should be aware of that we're asking that in this case, going back to problem formulation and thinking about the scale of the assessment, the scale of the ecological risk assessment as part of that problem formulation.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've made a pretty clear statement on that.
Yeah.
That it's just not an appropriate. And I didn't make a note that you hadn't justified it. So I think, or not appropriate, attributes. No, others have comments on this. I think you did a good job of.
I just want to make sure people are comfortable with it, understanding.
Yeah. So is the rest of the panel comfortable? Are you asking whether are we comfortable with the strength of the assertion? and the recommendation?
Yeah,
Oh.
so should I take the site here and add it to the comment in the receptors?
Sure.
I mean, does that,
Yeah, I mean, if the same citations are useful in multiple locations.
I
let's
mean,
do
I
it.
think it is, because I mean, the whole problem formulation includes receptors, pathways.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It's part and parcel, so I think I'll just add that site.
Good.
Okay. Other questions, comments, concerns on the exposure pathways?
Yeah, I have a question about the multimedia fate chemical. There was a reference, Lee et al. I'm not
Yeah.
really familiar with that, but it seems like Mackay reference should be included.
Well, it's the same, I guess, school of folks. So,
So is the et al. Is Mackay part of that paper?
yeah. So Mackay, yeah, the like the EQC model, the Mackay fugacity model goes
Yeah.
back to the mid '90s, and then you have John Arnott, who's one of his students and has since done, 20 years worth of work on multimedia fate models. His is called Radar. And then Lee, I can't remember if Lee was with Mackay or not, but he's sort of from the same school of thought. And it's, I think John Arnott is part of the group of authors for the Lee paper. And one comment, I don't know if it's relevant here, but that it was in a international meeting last week where the Canadian government was talking about how they were using these particular multimedia fate models for chemical exposure assessment in general, not for biosolids in particular, but more just to make the point that this is work that's been, in the scientific literature for 25 years, and is a pretty well considered approach. I'm not terribly facile with the I think it's 3MRA model, but my impression was that it considers all media, it just doesn't do it at the same time. It's sort of three individual single media models that are kind of brought together as one.
Okay, makes sense.
And I just have a question as to whether the tier 2 recommendation of the 10-meter buffer to the farm pond, if that shouldn't be a tier 1 recommendation. It seems like it's pretty important to include that buffer.
I don't have a problem with that. It seems like it could be easily. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Do we have supporting text? I'm just quickly looking on the buffer issue in the narrative.
I believe so.
Yeah. Yeah, they acknowledge that it may be technically not a water of the US, but by the same token, we think that it's any farm family who's going to be using it for all the purposes they are would certainly want to include that as a buffer.
Oh, I see. Okay, there's no.
Yeah,
buffer.
they're family
Oh,
farm.
Okay, right. It's in the comments. I got it. It's in the narrative text.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is.
Okay. So you're recommending that the tier 2 become a tier 1 and there are no tier 2s?
That's where we'd land, yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments on the issue of the exposure, whatever it is, exposure pathways? Yeah. Okie dokie. So then the next section is on the user guide, right? And my main thought was that we just try to be more, we asked for lots of, for amendments that basically, are clarifying, and I was thinking we would be well served by identifying specific instances where they could be, a little bit more detailed in what they're providing. And then Greg, I think you were the one who says, and please state that it doesn't work on Apple computers.
Yeah, that's a rather significant shortfall, I think.
And that's an interesting thing because so many things are positioned these days to be made into apps or whatever, and to be, out of one platform completely is a little odd, but whatever.
Yeah, I was very surprised when I was unable to, excuse me, run it and learn that was why.
Okay. So who's in charge of this section? I forget.
That would be me.
Oh, are you clear?
Yeah, yes, I think everything was captured. I mean, all the comments that were captured in this section.
Okay. And so then just clarifying examples was the main thing that I think would be helpful to them.
Okay.
I think I know that the assumption that it won't be used by people other than EPA is probably not a great one if they really want traction with this approach. So, yeah. Okay, and
Actually, can I just ask one quick question about this section?
Yeah.
Another thing that just wasn't captured really in the charge questions was I had a few comments on the white paper. I don't know if there's any mechanism to address those, or if we just sort of gloss over that. I was just curious because this seemed pretty specific to the user document.
So we can include, and the SAB has been, it is within our purview to add additional comments that are not strictly under the charge question. And so if they pertain to the user guide, I would put them under the user guide and make a statement, although not, not, included within the charge questions. We note and make the statement of your concerns. What are they, Jen?
So there was just a couple of minor things. I guess a couple of them were so minor as to probably not really be worth bringing up if we're going to add separate comments. But the one that I thought was sort of interesting and just worth considering is they have two different, in my mind at least, and maybe I'm not reading it right, but what it seemed like two different definitions of biosolids or about the biosolids process in the white paper, at least the way I read it, and they were at least worded very differently in two spots. So that seemed like something that was worth commenting on.
Didn't that get raised someplace? Isn't that?
It's captured here.
Oh, is it captured here? I apologize if I missed it.
It's in this section. It's like the third or fourth paragraph.
I'm sorry, Jennifer, that I missed that. I apologize.
That's okay. Yeah, go back up. It starts like clarity. That third paragraph is where it's captured.
Oh,
Section
okay.
6.1. Yeah.
Oh, so it is from the white paper. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
No, I think that's great. I was just assuming that we needed to kind of keep the comments focused on the user guide here, but I thought that this was sort of the most appropriate place to include it. I don't know if it'll get lost here, but it seems appropriate. So, okay, thank you for pointing that out.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think it's appropriate here because the charge question is, does it describe how to use the BST? Well, if it uses confusing terminology, that's not helpful.
Yeah, that was my only thought, is just to point that out to them. Okay, thanks so much.
All right, so then we don't have the tiered recommendations. There's lots of comments, but I think that tiered recommendations follow along with the text and include things like more explanations. But Jennifer, I'm open to suggestions about what and everybody else, what the tiered recommendation should be for this section.
No, I agree. The comments of where they need to offer clarity. And we talked about these at the in-person meeting, and I think his feedback on those comments were that they recognized that they needed to do that. So I don't know that making them tiered recommendations are really going to push it that much further. I don't know how you would.
I think it is.
It would be a good thing. Then they could say, yes, we did it.
We did it.
Okay. And I know in one other place there was a request for the acronyms section, to have the section on acronyms that were used. So maybe that can be, I can get some tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 recommendations typed up.
That would be great. I mean, even if there are things that they've said, oh, we know we need to do this. The full SAB may or may not hear EPA say that we know we need to do this. And so the fact that it's down and okay, we're asking them to do something, and then we hope they're going to do it. And so I think it's fine to, even though they said they're going to do it, let's write it down and then they can check the box.
I will get those to you.
All right, that'd be great.
Sylvie, can I ask a quick question?
Sure can.
Just following up on Greg's comment that the BST does not work on Apple. Is the BST limited just to the Windows platform, or can you use it on Linux as well? Or was there I didn't see anything about that.
It's Access database driven, which is a Microsoft product.
That's a Microsoft product. Okay, but could you run it on a Linux system or a virtual Linux system?
I don't know what that is. Is that something that's capable of using and running Access databases?
I think you can run that. You just download the Linux virtual Linux software to do that. But I don't know if that's been tried.
So maybe the recommendation is to clarify what systems will run the program.
Yeah, like the system requirements.
Yeah, your system requirements should be very clear.
Explicit. Yeah, I think that's a good baseline.
They clearly state that Apple is not one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not that. It's fine to state that Apple is not one of them, but what's more helpful is to state which are.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah. Compatibility.
I will do that.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd like to see as a recommendation is that they make the program available to anybody outside EPA. I mean, I'd like to use it. I'm sure utilities would like to use it. Seems like having them just keep it to themselves is not useful.
Yeah, I wasn't clear on that either, Drew, when we talked during the meeting about that. Just ultimately, like I thought they did say that they were going to make it available, but again, you know, things that were said, we want to just document in writing. This is something that would be very useful for people to be able to use as their own screening tool based on maybe some data from a particular municipality or anything like that. So, or
even as a teaching tool.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think that's a reason to improve the documentation is that I think they were, because they're open and transparent, but I think to make it as usable as possible is in their best interest.
And user-friendly.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that the point of the user guide? Otherwise, you wouldn't be having so many details on the user guide.
Yeah.
Even if some are lacking, it's a pretty substantial user guide.
And I think we can make a nice comment. We appreciate the effort that went into creating the user guide and recommend some additional clarifications simply because we can foresee many potential uses beyond just EPA.
Right.
Good.
Absolutely.
Okay, so Jennifer, you're good?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. That moves us on to the 2.3 section. And we have just 3 items there, A, B, and C. And so 3A is the refined risk assessment. And or 2.3 is and the first bit is on the data sources. I didn't have any particular comments on this section, and I don't know if others have questions or concerns. Paul, who's the lead on this?
Drew.
Drew, you're the lead. Anybody have comments or concerns? I thought yeah. I mean, I think we pointed them. You know, we don't have any new data sources, but talked about the parameters used and that kind of thing, and what to do if there isn't sufficient data. Anybody else? No. Sure, you get a gold
Oh,
star.
I noticed,
Okay.
I'm just trying to figure out if this fits here, is where Nakwa had asked EPA to clarify the sources of hazard values. So when we're talking about data sources,
Okay, that's an interesting point, Linda. But okay, data sources. Is that early?
they actually wanted it to be better defined because they didn't think it was clear. And maybe, I don't know if that's in the refined risk assessment, trying to see. But yeah, that would be here. So, defining clearly what is meant by a hazard value, is it a concentration based or a dose based toxicity reference value? And then what are the sources for these hazard values? So I think that falls under sources. Does anybody, would it be better somewhere else, or?
I'm trying to look at the letter right now, Linda.
That's on page 9 of their letter.
9.
Bottom of 8 and then page 9.
Okay. We're gonna do.
Did they recommend sources or they're
Asking EPA to just clarify what the sources are, and then they do have sub bullets there.
Okay.
6.5. Oh, for evaluating ecological hazard. Oh, so
Yeah, it is for the ERA.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a valid.
Yeah, so they do, it looks like they do recommend some.
Are they talking benchmark values? Like I'd have to go back to.
Yeah, there's a benchmark tool, I guess they recommend. That would be a new source.
Right, and then there's NOALs, LOALs, blah blah blah.
So I could include something about this.
And some of this maybe was in this, in the screening risk assessment versus refined risk assessment, but it's a little confusing because they also talk about adjustments in the fate and transport models. So that's, again, more of the refined risk assessment.
Yeah, it seems more about the refined.
I think so.
And then is there a recommendation from this?
There are several comments and some have recommendations, but in other cases, they just want clarification.
Yep.
But I felt like their comments were quite valid.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I can definitely add something in the text, and I'll think about if a tier 2 or maybe tier 3 recommendation comes out of it.
Yeah, and then I guess the next point we'll be talking about fate and transport models, but everything they brought up, we actually had brought up and discussed, so we definitely.
I thought we covered it pretty thoroughly.
I thought we covered a lot of what they are
Yeah,
commenting
may
on.
have
Maybe
some
they're just
useful
giving an
additional-
affirmation. Mhm.
they may have some useful additional references.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you haven't taken a look at that particular, that it was a very thorough document. The Kings County one was fairly short, and primarily concerned with, the overall items we had highlighted. Okay. So we have the note to address and are you clear? Are you clear on,
Yeah, and what to add?
yeah, what to
Yeah,
add?
yeah, so I'll go back to that page 9 on NACWA and summarize that, put it in the text, and then create a recommendation from it.
Okay. Oh, Shanta just sent a note about an additional written comment. Hang on one sec. Okay, we'll go back and pick that up. Yeah, it's an additional submitted comment. I'll go cycle back when we've gone through the rest of the, sorry for the pause. I'm just going to my emails there. Okay. So Drew, you're set on the data sources and the comments on supporting, reflecting NACWA's concerns on the clarification of the hazard values, et cetera. Okay.
Yes.
All right, so then the next item here is where did we go? We're getting toward the end. It is on the transport models, right? Okay. And
I think
go ahead.
if you scroll down to 5 is where the plant uptake is, and I have a citation we can add to that.
Okay.
Who's the lead on this again? Is this
the lead on this?
I think this one is me.
okay? I couldn't remember.
Yeah, no,
Yes,
my gosh,
Jen.
no worries.
Jen, it's you.
Okay.
So so Lisa, you'll send that to me and I can add it.
I can actually, I have like a red line of 5 that I'll just copy. And
perfect.
can I just, Shantae, just when we talk again at the end and everyone reminds us of how we're supposed to, the process for doing this, it's okay. For example, like if I have like a little red line to send to a lead, if it's something I can help with, as long as I CC Sylvie and Shantae.
Yes. But we'll go over. Shantae, go ahead. Shantae,
I figured you would.
Shantae, go ahead and turn back on. Go ahead.
Oh, no, that's correct, Lisa. Thank you.
Okay. I'm like, I know you're going to remind us.
We know she's there thinking about all the things we're going to need to be reminded about.
Yeah. So I'll send that to you. Jen.
Yeah. So Jennifer, there's a lot of things again that NACWA pointed out that we also discussed, and I think that it's in our document, but you might want to just make sure, and we can discuss them now if there's anything that we disagree with, but you might want to make sure that we've emphasized it sufficiently in some
Okay,
of the.
totally agree. Yeah, let's make sure, I want to make sure there's particular things that you all, because some of this is a little bit more on the ecotox side, and that's not where I'm not as strong. So I want to make sure I'm not missing anything that you all think is important, especially on that, in that area, on that topic.
Yeah, I think you just need to make sure you include like ionization, ionizable compounds.
I think we've got that in there. Let's just make sure. I'm
We
just
do.
looking.
We talk about absorption at the air-water interface for PFAS as being a significant attenuation. Is this also where the dilution, let's see, the DAF, which we've also talked about, it's set as, got my notes everywhere mixed up now.
That's in number 3. If you look on pages 22 and 23, see if that is sufficient. I'm just looking for I know we addressed the ionization. Let me just make sure where that is here.
I think maybe the mistake is that most of the time the DAF attenuation factor, this was something we discussed, it was set to 1.
Yeah.
Except that and the same thing, the biological hydrolysis biodegradation was set to 0. And this was brought up when we met in person. And I thought, and I don't know why it's not clear, and so now it brings haziness again, that Dave Tobias said that it was the upper foot of the soil, I forget, upper meter, whatever, I forget what that distance was, I have to find my notes, actually did include degradation and sorption.
That's right, he did say that.
But we had to really dig that out of him. And once again, NACWA still feels like it's not, it's still got a DAF of 1 for everything and no biodegradation. So somehow it's not clear in the document still.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think it is. Excuse me, a DAF of 1.
Yeah, I'm still confused on that whole approach. They need to really clarify what models they're using and how they're actually doing it. Because somewhere I read that they were taking the leachate out of the till layer, but then Tobias said no, it goes down 2 meters or something. But I didn't see anything in the documentation that they're modeling down to 2 meters.
Yeah, so what we should specify in this document is that it's unclear, and what we recommend, the DAFB, that attenuation factors that include interaction with the soil and biodegradation that does occur in especially the root zone, that all those things should be included, and maybe they are, but it is definitely not clear.
So it's my notes said in DAF, and I think David says biodegradation not included. So perhaps clarity issue with DAF write-up. No biodegradation in vadosome. Could do it, but don't plan to.
Okay. Well, I agree with the NACWA comments, and I think
biodegradation depends on availability of data to parameterize. Yeah. That's the extent of my notes.
Right. Well, this gets back to the biosolid relevant matrix, because biosolids enhance microbial communities, enhance a lot of things. And so I think that even if they're in a ballpark range of something for biotransformation, that it should be included. So, and I think NACWA also agrees with that. And definitely they should be including, attenuation more than 1 foot. If it's 1 foot, I don't remember it being for the whole 2 feet. I don't remember, but just if they're doing it, great, but it is clearly not clear, because even other people are still coming up with those same concerns. And it should be.
And Greg, would you be able to send me just your thoughts briefly on that, and then I can incorporate them just to make sure I accurately capture what it is that the concern is?
Yeah, sure. No problem.
Yeah, Drew.
Thank you so much.
True, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. To me, and you get to the refined assessment, and they do have, a one-dimensional model they use for both unsaturated and saturated zone. I don't know why they just don't use that for the BST.
Okay.
So we should recommend that. It's actually almost a tier 1 recommendation.
Yeah, and it's not really that much more effort to do, you know.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll send it.
so we're gonna we want clarity on the what's being done about or not being done with attenuation. And they need to specify that, and then the recommendation is
To include, I think maybe Drew hit it on the head why there's a confusion, because eventually they include it, but not in some of the earlier screenings. So
Yeah, so just to use a, you know, a fate transport model for unsaturated and saturated zone
okay.
and get away from the DAF.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay. Jen, you know what you're doing there?
I think so. I'm gonna, if it's okay, just send it around to the smaller group just to make
Yeah.
sure that it's accurately captured.
CC, Shantae, and me.
Perfect. I will do that.
Stuff our mailboxes.
Perfect.
We have a new filtering system here at Purdue, and most of my mail is going to my junk.
Oh no, maybe that's good.
It took me a few days to figure out why I didn't see airplane ticket receipts and things like that.
Oh no.
Okay, so now
I had just one question on
Sure.
this one, which is, after reviewing this again, I am thinking that the tier 2 recommendation, so this is on the top of page 24, the SAB recommends that EPA refine and consider background levels for common substances. I'm thinking that that should maybe be a tier 1 recommendation, given the importance of background. And I know it's a tier 1 recommendation already at the screening level. So wanted to see what you all thought about moving that to tier 1 and then having at this point, no tier 2 recommendations.
I support it. It comes up in other places too, so it will also maybe even be a overarching issue.
Okay, agreed.
And I
Everybody
actually had
okay
a-
with
I
that?
support that.
Yeah, I support that too. But I also had a note here that I had a suggestion of moving tier 3 up to a tier 2.
Oh, okay. Oh, let's take a look at that. Yeah,
Well,
I mean, that's an interesting point. It was really, yeah, I don't know. I don't think I had a chance, since we were kind of working on this separately, but I did go back and do a deep dive into the models that might be appropriate for dermal pathways for this particular tool. And it's very limited what's actually available at the agency level. And in fact, specifically, the model that they try to follow, which seems like the appropriate one, the 3MRA model, does not include appropriately any of the right sort of dermal considerations. You know, for example, considering inhalation potential, exposure potential in the shower, but not the dermal exposure potential, was a little surprising to me. So I made the recommendation that I think they need something that's more robust, that considers the dermal pathway in a more integrated way that I'm just not seeing in the current the models that are available from EPA. And I've suggested some other places, but none of them are really complete from my perspective. There's a lot of good information here, but if you all agree, we could move that up to tier 2. I was a little bit surprised to see that, and I've been away from the agency for quite some time now, but I was a little bit surprised about that.
Well, I just want to say that I'm still, when you think about the important pathways, I just don't think dermal exposure is that important. I mean,
It really depends on the substance, for sure. I mean, there's no question.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that once it's in the water, if it gets to the water, then maybe you could have, dermal absorption in the shower. But Yeah, just, yeah, so that's the only reason I wouldn't make it tier 2, because I actually
Okay.
don't think it's I personally don't think it's a very substantial exposure pathway for chemicals in biosolids at all. But that's just my assessment, my opinion.
I think that's totally fair. And I guess my thought was just to make it consistent. You know, does it make sense to evaluate the inhalation for the shower water and not the dermal? I guess was the way I phrased it here. Not saying that they should include dermal necessarily, but to make it consistent.
So I'm not a human health person, so Drew can comment on risk assessment, but inhalation pathway, when it crosses the lung, you know, when you inhale it and it, you know, aerosols and things, and then it can cross the lung tissue, that's a much different scenario than it going into your, you know, soaking into your skin and getting
Just depends on the substance.
It really does, because some can, like, especially certain things like dioxins and PCBs actually can really cross the transdermal barrier very readily, or
Exactly.
even some pH.
Yeah, but they have to be in the water to begin with.
No, soils.
Oh, but she was talking about the shower pathway right now.
Well, that's one example of an inconsistency.
Okay. Yeah, I think we were being broader on the dermal, and I actually agree in general for certainly things like aqueous, you know, and biosolids. Some of this maybe is not as pertinent, but there are some constituents, some of the organics in particular.
When they're in a biosolid matrix, this is back to the biosolid matrix.
You know, there's just not. I mean, it definitely is true for sediments and soils, and sediments, you know, are pretty wet. So, you know, if it can happen in a sediment, I guess, could it happen in a, you know, wet biosolid? I guess, and certainly in a drier pelletized.
We have data for humans sticking their arms in sediment and getting transfer.
I mean, there's a risk assessment.
I mean, not biosolids, sediments. You made the comment on sediments. I just want to ask.
Right. Yeah. So do we have epidemiological data on all these chemicals? Of course not. No, but that's not the way risk assessment works.
But we do have measurable transfer data. For example, for most metals, they will readily transfer in their elemental state to the skin from a variety of surfaces. So we know that the transfer is occurring, and they are becoming readily available on the skin surface for exposure. So that would absolutely be a potential solid pathway.
Yeah, so it can happen. You know, and I actually think like we've said all over the place, things like the inhalation pathway to me seems much more pertinent for the applicator, who is typically not even the farmer. So, you know, there's lots of conservatism and just sort of broad assumptions that are being made to keep it simple by EPA, which, you know, I get again for a screening level, but when it's going down to a more refined analysis, I think that's where some of these comments are pertinent. You know, if it rises.
Yeah, I agree, Lisa. I think it's at least important to be consistent, internally consistent with the approach.
Yeah, so I think maybe that's the crux of the comment, right? Is that, you know, the biosolids panel debated the importance of the specific pathway, but you know, at a minimum, recommend internal consistency with the approach.
So should we add that as a tier 1 recommendation here? I've got some comments on it, and I haven't put it in this specific list of recommendations, but I could certainly add that. Right now it's at the top of this section, just generally.
Can you tell me page and line?
Yes, hold on one second.
Were you saying though you were asking us if we were gonna move the the current tier 2 comment to tier 1, right?
I think that's still on the table for discussion. Okay. I think we're moving we're going to move the current tier 2 to tier 1, which is the background. But the question is whether we also move the tier 3 to tier 2, the current tier 3, which is on page 24, line 9 through 13. And then Sylvie, to answer your question, the discussion about the inconsistency with the different transport pathways is beginning on number 4, line 14 to 31 on page 23. And that's captured kind of right now, kind of more broadly in the tier 3 recommendation. But it doesn't directly address the internal consistency question in the tiers.
Well, I guess it's how important do you think it is, you know, in terms of is just internal consistency. If it's worthy of a rec, it's worthy. I mean,
I think at the refined risk assessment level, it's worth considering. I mean, I would also love to hear some thoughts from all of you on how important it is to maybe call out this particular issue. I mean, it's certainly listed in here, so it's not that we're missing it. It's just, do we want a specific bulleted or pointed out item here in this in the specific recommendations to reinforce it?
I think one thing we need to be mindful of is in a lot of places in the deterministic, we're really saying you're including too much stuff, you're being too conservative, we have all this compounding conservatism. And then when we get to this section for the refined risk assessment, we're saying you should look at this, you should include, we should include that. And I agree, but I think we might need some kind of intro piece to this section saying like, okay, so the only things that are really being included in the refined risk assessment are those that kind of rose to the top. So, hopefully these comparisons to background get done and those compounds drop out if things are consistent with background or nutritionally required, levels, things like that. So get rid of all of those things. So now we're only left with things that, if EPA takes some of our comments and recommendations to really hone in on the key pathways of concern, use a mix of central tendency and upper bound values that are going to be protective but more realistic, and things are still rising to the top. That's this hopefully pretty small group of compounds that we're left with. So at that point, I do think it's hopefully going to be such a small number of constituents that we're really honing in on a probabilistic type approach on, that we can get these additional refinements, these more sophisticated models, maybe empirical data on things like BAFs and BCFs and et cetera. So this is where we're hoping they are going to spend more time and be more thorough and inclusive. But I kind of feel like we need to say that somewhere.
I had made a note that we want to make a framing consideration statement at the deterministic screening level. And now, so that wouldn't be inconsistent to then make a framing statement at the probabilistic level.
Right. I don't know. I don't know what other people
I
think.
agree.
Okay. But Greg has his hand up, so.
Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that those are good points. The only comment I was going to make gets back to the question of the dermal exposure and pathway, and I guess it comes down to again to the question of the biosolids matrix. I look at the work that's been done to show the biosolids actually reduces the bioavailability of a number of metals. We use it to clean up lead contaminated sites and arsenic contaminated sites because it makes those metals less available biologically. So, I guess a question would be, again, can we ensure that they use all the data that they need to use and consider the biosolids matrix?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, I think that doesn't result in an elimination of exposure, right? But it's certainly a consideration. So absolutely.
Just a thought.
I agree with that.
Okay, so I'm still not exactly clear what our framing of statement here is going to be.
So it sounds like, I guess the one key thing I feel like we still need to figure out is, or decide, is whether we want to move the tier 3 recommendation on top of page 24 to a tier 2. I think there's some differing views on that, and whether we'd want to add to that a comment about considering the internal consistency of the transport pathways and the overall exposure pathways that are being evaluated at this refined risk assessment level, because there seems to still be, based on the available models and what's recommended in the user guide and the white paper, some inconsistency in that approach right now. I guess I would recommend that we do maybe call out, now that we've had this discussion, call out this inconsistency in a more specific way as a key point, either under tier 2 or tier 3. And I could go either way on whether we move the current tier 3 to tier 2.
Thoughts on that suggestion, folks?
Well, I vote to leave it as tier 3, but that's my vote.
I think it's worthy, Jennifer, of clarifying, making a concise statement about Florence has to go. Bye, Florence.
Bye, Florence.
About
Yeah.
About the consistency.
Okay, so I will add that as a tier 2 then, and keep the current tier 3 where it is, and move the current tier 2 on background levels to tier 1. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah, I think so.
Sounds good.
And then other thing, more importantly, is we're also adding a new tier 1 and maybe a couple of new tier 1s. I'm going to need just some clarification just to make sure I'm correctly characterizing it regarding the DAF factor and the using a fate and transport model that would encompass both saturated and the unsaturated zone. And I think I also heard that we want to make sure we explicitly call out ionization and how ionization is addressed. So Linda, maybe you can also help me with that piece.
Yeah, because we talked about two things, species, when chemicals ionize, and also absorption at the air-water interface. So basically just DAF should not just be one. We ought to be, it ought to be varied depending on a compound behavior. And the other thing was, I think biotransformation should be included. I don't actually accept the response we got that it's too hard to include some level of biotransformation.
Okay.
I think we can say we challenge the assertion that this is too hard.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, and now on to the last, and then I have a return cleanup, which might have been 1B and Florence just left, but anyway, the last bit is on the scenarios, and there were some comments here and there about the overall scenarios, additional scenarios. I had some confusion about the specific point on the state of Maine. But then also Greg had a bunch of concerns about inaccurate assertions and that kind of thing. So who's in charge of that one?
Sylvia, I think I am.
Oh, and you were going to share your screen, is that right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can share my screen, I guess. Okay.
Because you had you written?
Yeah, I sent out my responses to I think they were your concerns.
Okay.
Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Uh-oh.
I'm not the host.
You're good now. You can go ahead, Mike.
Okay, let me see if I can do that. Okay. Okay, can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so I don't want to read what I
Yeah,
wrote.
yeah,
but
no.
Let
I
me just
didn't-
summarize. Let me just quickly summarize. The first question you had was about the state of Maine.
Yeah, right.
And this, this was, and I would encourage Ian to chime in if I miss any point here. But basically, what we were saying is that the state of Maine now has banned all land application of biosolids because of the determination that the high levels of PFAS found in dairy milk was probably due to land applied biosolids. There's been some question about that. So the recommendation here was that the agency should look at situations where they're applying very large amounts of biosolids, and then look at what are the potential human health exposures. And so when we look at very large amounts of land application, it only falls under the category of land reclamation. So you're never going to be applying 100 tons per acre unless you're trying to reclaim a site. And so what Ian had pointed out was that back a few years ago, I guess 10 years ago now, that there was a lot of work done in mining where they looked at application of biosolids at rates exceeding 100 tons per acre. Now,
Yeah,
150.
it's 150 tons per acre. So again, looking at the human health exposure, especially food security issues associated with that application.
Michael, can I ask a question?
Oh, sure.
And I've done a lot of work with Maine, and remember, it was largely a political decision,
Right.
a science-based decision. So another key problem is that Maine, literally, they would take like one sample of biosolids at a farm and one sample of milk at a farm, and they would make, and this was like literally, it was a handful of farms that it was found in the milk at elevated levels, a very, very small number. And a conflating problem was that some of it was paper mill industrial biosolids, and it's not the municipal biosolids. So there were just so many problems related. Like, I think it's worthy to mention, but I also don't want to give a lot of scientific credence to how Maine reached that.
Yeah.
So I just want us to be very careful about how we.
I hear you, Lisa.
Right. No, no.
I really would recommend avoiding Maine altogether. It was really paper
Like
mill.
that state. Okay,
No,
yeah.
no, I think you're right. The state of Maine overreacted, but we have to at least acknowledge, it resulted in the euthanizing of at least one herd of dairy cattle, if not several herds.
It's at least 3, but I guess I'm trying to figure out, how are you linking that to the large biosolids land application? Like, those almost seem like are those 2 different points? Because
Right.
Yeah, I'm confused about that also.
yeah, so I think it would be better to bifurcate maybe. I just think it's getting blended in a way that maybe.
I mean, in a way, without mentioning Maine has already been that situation of, assuming the highest exposure pathways are resulting, or incorrect pathways. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I
Very
think
excited.
Yeah, the main point here is that the issue in Maine were very heavily industrially contaminated materials. And that it was because of food packaging. One paper mill impregnated paper products with PFAS, another one recycled them. They both wound up on land, one through a municipality, the other directly. So, I just think the only point here is the need for source control.
Yeah, and I think, and confounding industrial versus other biosolids sourcing and the processing, I think that's part of the problem, right?
Right.
So is there anything wrong with just getting rid of those first sentences and starting this with given?
Where is given?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, I think that. Well, Ian, do you want to chime in here? Because this was kind of a point that you highlighted.
Yeah, well,
I mean, I could take a, I think what Lisa's saying is we just get rid of the first sentence. Is that what you're
It's-
recommending, Lisa? Because I think that's fine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
just starting with given that
it's
there,
not a correct statement, is it? Well, I mean.
it is.
It
It's
is.
new.
There's no federal limits on the amount of biosolids that you can apply in a land reclamation site.
Yeah, the issue was putting on industrially contaminated.
And it was
Biosolids.
not a land reclamation
No.
site, it was an agricultural
municipal.
site.
Right, yeah, so I'm saying,
What
Nor
is the
were they heavy
actual scenario?
applications.
what's our point? Like,
actual
what's our
scenario?
takeaway?
Yeah, what's the actual scenario that you want them to add to the scenarios they have already? Because this is it's not, I'm like, okay, this is all true and not true, or it's all true, but what recommendation are we giving them for the application scenario? Are we saying that they need to do an application scenario for land reclamation at much higher rates than they currently are proposing?
It's a scenario that they haven't really looked at. And you could just dump the first sentence. I agree with that.
Greg, you have another comment?
No, sir, I just didn't lower my hand,
Okay.
but I'm not sure about this.
Yeah, I would agree that we probably just get rid of the first sentence. But I think the point is, and Ian, correct me if I'm wrong here, that while in most states, well, I shouldn't say most states, in many states, there is a limit to how much biosolids can be land applied for land reclamation. But that's on a state by state basis, and I guess there's only a few states that have implemented that limit, but no one's looked at these, this 100 dry tons per acre, which is a really, exceedingly high amount of biosolids. But if you're able to do that on a mining site and then bring animals onto that site, the question is, are you increasing potential human health exposure through food contamination?
Okay, so I get it, I think. You're saying that for land reclamation that can have much more biosolids applied than an ag scenario, and we can propose a range that has been used. When this is restored, when the land is considered restored by non-PFAS standards, I guess, right? Then what would happen? Then what would happen if it now is used for grazing animals or dairy or anything like that? That's the scenario that you.
That's what I'm thinking. The scenario is. Ian,
Yeah.
you agree?
Yep.
I would just say, I question, why are we calling out PFAS? Wouldn't this be true for any constituent? If you're separating it from Maine, I think that it's true for any constituent.
To gauge the potential
I would agree.
impact of land applied biosolids, just get rid of people.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Greg.
Yeah. Like
Then-
we all know the genesis.
Yeah,
We're all sensitive, but yeah.
beginning at the word given, I think is okay then.
Okay, so we'll just remove the reference to PFAS
Yep.
and sort of but still highlight the large amounts of biosolids that can be applied, and its potential effect on human food supplies. Okay.
So we only care about human food supplies and we don't care about ERA now?
Okay, well, that's okay. Let's have another, let's further that discussion then.
Because the whole thing is really written out of what happened in Maine. So if we're going to make a scenario that's just general, it's human health and also ERA.
Okay, so human health and ecological. Okay.
Yeah, so you need to basically
Right.
DPFAS this whole paragraph.
Yeah. Okay. Ian, are you comfortable with that?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay. Okay.
Okay,
So I think, yeah, I can revise that,
all right.
revise that section.
So we're getting rid of main, removing specific references to PFAS and broadening from human health to all ecological receptors.
Right, right.
Ka-ching. Okay.
Okay. So, okay, so any other comments on that section?
No, I think
Okay.
we're good.
All right, let me go down a little further. Okay, so Sylvia, you had some questions about stocking rates and
Oh,
reducing.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, okay, let me just say, you know, if we're talking, depending who you're talking to, okay, if you're talking to a researcher and we're talking about stocking rates, and I say that I can increase the stocking rate from 0.05 to 0.2, that might mean something to you as a researcher.
Yeah.
That means nothing to the farmer or the rancher. Okay, they have no idea what that means. Okay, so what I did, and I think we need to go back now, they would understand the inverse of that. Okay, that you know, in one case you can put 20 animals per acre, you put biosolids down, now you can put, you know, excuse me.
So I would simply add in parenthetically your numerator and denominator.
Right.
So people just know, okay, with my stocking rate, I'm not thinking of animals per land unit. I'm thinking of
Acres per animal unit.
Acres per animal unit.
Right. So, you know, the traditional way of thinking about stocking rate is that, you know, the stocking rate is always going to be less than 1, but that doesn't mean anything. What the rancher wants to know is how many acres is it going to require for me per cow.
Yeah,
for
so
grazing
just
season.
I guess maybe just be clear because the other way I've seen it expressed is animals per certain size, right? So you have not just 1 acre, but you know, a range size.
Okay. Okay. So,
So
well,
just be explicit with numerator and denominator.
right. Okay. Now, the other problem, not problem, but other concern is that you know, you mentioned overgrazing. Well, if it's overgrazed, it would be considered it would be considered disturbed or
Yeah,
marginal. And what that would mean is that you could apply biosolids to that site at levels much higher than agronomic rates. By doing that, now you're adding more contaminants or potential pollutants
right.
onto that site. How does that affect your grazing stock? And that was the only point I was making, is that if you consider it overgrazed land, that's a disturbed site now.
Okay.
So,
I think as long as we're explicit.
okay, so I can go back and, like I said, massage that even more.
Well, let's just make it explicit, I think, is that, you know, okay, now it's disturbed land, which would permit an even higher application.
Okay. Okay.
Because I think it is a confusing, you know, potential scenario. What are you assuming? And, you know, when does something become overgrazed too? That's a subjective decision.
Well, yeah, you know, except the agency and states provide a lot of flexibility in what they will consider disturbed land, or you know, marginal lands, and so it can be practically anything.
Yeah, no, I know this. I know, because of characterizing marginal lands for crop production. What does it mean?
Right.
You know, so.
Okay. Let me go down a little further then. Then the other point you made was about fugitive dust and the health risk to farmers. And so let's see, the panel also discussed risks to adjacent non-farm communities. Should that be added? And I thought that was a good point that you made. I think that we should add that.
Yeah, because I think in a lot of cases where we are talking about something that's fugitive, we know that we have rural or even, peri-urban populations that might be exposed, that may even have a higher exposure rate because they're living in, a little community where they're getting a high exposure.
Right, exactly. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that the agency does recommend that there be a buffer zone between the boundary
Okay,
of the site and any residential community. But they never tell you, what size of a boundary do you need?
okay.
And they don't tell you, what sort of, plant vegetation you should have on that boundary. And so, there've been court cases where people have claimed that they've gotten sick because of things that have come off of the land application site. Okay, so I think I agree with you that for the adjacent non-farm community, fugitive dust is going to be an issue that should be evaluated.
Okay.
The other point that you made, Sylvie, was the point about the effect of pyrolysis on chemicals and biosolids.
Do we have a citation?
Well, I think, that's why I'm glad that Greg is here, because Greg, the last time that I even talked to anyone about biochar, because that's what this refers to, is biochar, was somebody in the city of Santa Rosa, California. And I don't know if they're doing any biochar production and land application anywhere in California, but that was the last time I had spoken to someone. That was at least 10 years ago.
So there's Greg and Lisa and Linda all have their hands up.
Okay.
I've got two comments, if I might. One, back to the dust. I still have a hard time with dust because it's the act of farming that creates dust. Do you separate out, what do the biosolids have to do with that? Nothing. It's
Right.
not because of them being heat-dried pellets. The dust is from the farming. So I have a hard time even bringing that into it.
I agree with you on that point. It is the farm activity that's causing that. So that's the question that we have to answer: is you've got the biosolids mixed with the soil. Is that does that exacerbate the problem, having the biosolids as part of that matrix?
I would argue
it's
compared to
really
commercial fertilizer or anything else. Lisa,
it's a really minimal pathway, guys. Like, I think
Yeah.
we're getting way too hung up on something. This is it's minuscule. And even when you run the BST model for things, the air concentrations and the inhalation risks, even on the property, are negligible within the BST. So I would not be a fan of adding this. And I think for the sewage sludge landfill, Sylvie and Mike, that is that's that abutter I was talking about. So that is a more pertinent pathway for that. But for just like the types of thin, basically tilled in, irrigated, and then planted farms that we're talking about, to me, this is just, we're really making a big deal of something that is not, I think, a significant pathway at all. So I would not be a fan of advocating for that, unless you're talking about the sewage sludge landfill abutter, the non-farm people that are living next to these things. And it is already there. It's already captured. So if it's not going to be a problem on the farms, there's no way it's going to be a problem even further. We're not talking like a big point source incinerator. Those are the types of situations where you can have, significant transport or industrial air emissions. Again, significant, through air mod and other things, significant transport. But we're talking about something that's like land applied, vegetated, mixed with soil, irrigated, which is future.
No, that's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is if you land apply, let's say you're land applying a lime stabilized material, Okay, so you got
On a farm.
on a farm, on a farm,
Oh, you mean a
And-
lime stabilized biosolid?
a lime stabilized biosolids.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you got this chemical of lime, and you got this organic matter of biosolids. You're going in there with your tilling equipment or okay.
But just during the application, which is
This is
short
you're mixing the soil. You're mixing the
Yeah.
biosolids with the soil. Okay, so you're tilling. Okay,
right.
before you plant, before you irrigate, before
Yeah,
you know,
Yep.
you're
That's
going to be generating a lot of dust.
right.
Same as
They-
when
For
you're
a
spraying
very
potash.
short
And-
period.
They already
Very short.
have that in the model for the farm. And what I'm saying is, if you even look at the risk to the farmer at the farm, it's a really small pathway.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay,
So that
okay.
I am understanding that. So I guess, to me,
Okay.
it's really at the landfills, there's a lot more, there's daily activity there. They're doing daily cover. There's all kinds of,
True.
they're mounting things, and they're creating height too, which is much more of concern for, further.
But that's not
And-
that's not the type of landfill we're talking about for biosolids.
But in the scenario you're describing though, Mike, I mean, that's farming.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
So if
fine.
you're putting potash on, you have the
Right.
same
It
thing.
could be anything.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I agree 100%. But
So,
what-
yeah.
so
I
I can
wouldn't call it out.
My
Well,
main comment was to be consistent, because when somebody farms, they're in their tractor, whatever, they have some exposure, but just drive around, you can see the big plumes of fugitive dust landing on, actually on our research farm. It all ends up on the trailer park immediately to the east. We have a strong history of moving large amounts of dust and soil from the west to the east, including, measurable pounds of potash and phosphorus and all the other kinds of things, and organic matter. So anyway, it's just about consistency. So
Okay.
we've got Linda, still have Lisa, we have Greg, who has their hand up with
I
Linda.
think I already dealt, I think, I just want to support what's been said. I don't think it should be included on what we were just talking about.
Okay.
And you had asked, Mike, you had said, so the whole biochar thing, you wanted to know, what was the question? Oh, the effect of pyrolysis.
Do we have a reference for the change composition? That's all.
Yeah, you just wanted a reference. So I guess two things happen, right? Some chemicals might actually break down or end up in the fuel that you're making, the energy, but they also don't get released from the same way. So I guess I have to go back and see what the comment was about pyrolysis. I don't know if it belongs in this document.
And I can answer a little bit to Mike's question. There's only one pyrolysis unit in operation in America that I know of, and that's in Redwood City, California. It has not operated consistently ever in its 6-year history. So there is not biochar being land applied to any significant amount. They do some of it. They use it for other purposes, but they do not produce it consistently. So we don't have an answer to biochar. All we have are lab data.
Yeah, I guess that's my experience. When biochar is brought up, is that, a decade ago, there was a lot of, or more than a decade ago, a lot of frantic excitement about how we were going to sequester all kinds of carbon by adding biochar to agricultural fields. And, there's still some biochar enthusiasts, but not much has happened.
Yeah, well, but I do want to differentiate between biochar and biosolids derived biochar.
Biochar, yeah.
Okay, because
But-
there's a lot of research that's still going on about biochar and trying to improve poor quality soils. Okay, so there's still a lot of research in that area, but the area that we were focused on, and Greg, I think, addressed this, is that, biosolids derived biochar has a very, very small footprint, and maybe we shouldn't even talk about it. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think we should talk about it because it's going to be a totally different creature than biosolids. And we just are complicating things. And yeah.
I agree.
I'm okay with that.
I agree with that too, because although I would say there is research on restoring soils with biochar, the efficiencies in that system are incredibly low, and the amount of biochar you got to add is bizarrely high, and there are other things you can do to improve your soils.
Yeah, well, there's biochar. There's a lot of research just getting started on the role of biochar, not biosolids-based biochar necessarily, on mitigating PFAS in this case, PFAS plant uptake and stuff. But I just think in the context of this screening that we're trying to help with, that it doesn't fit.
Okay, so we've had a very robust and enthusiastic discussion on
You saved the best for last. Okay,
Mike, you know what you're doing.
No, but well, it looks like I'm pulling more things out. So I don't think this last comment. I think the last comment just goes away.
Yeah.
Okay.
Linda.
I just wanted to, in case it got forgotten, because I know we're running out of time, the question that came to us via the email really is valid, is to make sure, that we can include a comment about concentrations of chemicals in biosolids.
Yeah, I think though we already have it right at the front.
Right, and make sure current, like that that there is supposed to be regular evaluation. So I think that email was about, not just about comparing things to, when we think about concentrations, well, is that relevant to what's in biosolids? Well, it depends what biosolid table they're going to use. And a lot of chemicals, their concentrations have decreased substantially in the biosolids. So to emphasize that they should be using current biosolids data.
Yeah, but I think that is even in one or something like that, where I asked for a reference that, under IAM concerns on page 4, line 16, 17, our stated biosolid chemical concentrations current. For example, PFAS concentrations are much lower now than 20 years ago.
Okay. Yeah.
So my suggestion was referencing, but I think that I had thought we included that.
Okay. It probably that email that came through during our discussion, because we discussed, well, where are they getting these concentrations? Have they,
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Because of that.
So I had looked at that and thought, oh, my comment was going to be that. So this comment came from Elena Naumova from the Journal of Public Health Policy. Our stated biosolid chemical concentrations current, for example, biosolid PFAS concentrations 17 are much lower than 20 years ago. I'm not sure what the 17 means, but it's basically, I thought we had covered that fairly well. Thoughts from others?
Agree.
I agree.
Mhm.
Okay. So I think we've talked about most things. And is there something that anybody desperately hasn't heard and wants raised? Comments, concerns? I think as we went, yes, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say one thing, because we brought it up in some of our comments, is as we're reviewing the document as a whole, one of the comments we made is that EPA themselves use several different versions of what biosolids mean, and we tend to use sewage sludge and biosolids, and those are not the same thing. Really, sewage sludge is much more highly regulated for land application than biosolids are, so we should be careful in our document not to make the same mistake that they did.
Right. Okay. So we should be consistent in our language use and
Because
not
we've asked them to.
slip into their, which they justified saying, well, this is what it used to be called, and these terms are interchangeable, with
Yep.
historical referencing, but that's not.
No. It doesn't, I mean, we can't keep just using them interchangeably and referencing why we do it. Stop doing it interchangeably and know that's why we do it.
Yeah, no, I get it. I understand completely. Other thoughts and comments? Okay, so what I've heard is that I think, we have our options are to have a consensus vote on the report, and the option is as is, consensus with the revisions we've discussed, or non-consensus. And I'm going to put out there, I think we're at consensus with the revisions we've discussed.
Do you want us to vote with our hands up?
You can all turn. Okay, we can say yes. So Shanta wants everybody to vote with their hands up. All in favor, put your thumb up, put your hand up, do the hokey-pokey. What I will counter. Okay, so all right. And is there any opposed vote? Drew, you're opposed?
No. I'm trying to get,
You
trying to
can't
get my
take your
hand
hand
lowered.
down. Okay. All right. All right. So I see none opposed. So that means that I will, with the lead, I have made notes. I hope the leads have made notes. And I know that there's some people who were not initially involved with one group or the other who are going to donate a reference here or there or a key sentence, and we'll have some exchanges. And the key thing is when emailing, just please CC me and Shantae. And I think with that, Shantae, I'm going to turn it back to you because I'm sure I've forgotten something.
No, you haven't. So thank you everyone for a fantastic meeting this afternoon. And we did really good keeping to our agenda and just went over by a few minutes. So thank you everyone for putting in the time to get through a very robust discussion. I will be following. Go ahead.
Yeah, Shantae, what's our timeline for revisions?
I was just going to mention that. I am looking at July 24th, if the leads could finalize their revisions and send those over to me and Sylvie by July 24th, that would be great. And then she and I will work to finesse the report and move it forward for the quality review. And I will, of course, follow up by email.
Go ahead, Greg.
Well, just wondering, will we get a chance then to see the put together final report?
The revised report will be made available for the public ahead of the SAB chartered meeting. We do not have a date for that meeting as of yet.
But so I'm going to recommend that if you have don't work in your own little isolated, if you have questions or whatever, as you're doing your revisions, please feel free to email me and CC Shantae, and so that when we're piecing things together, we are more integrated. I am fine with doing, and Shantae can say, no, we can't do this, but my suggestion would be we compile everything and then push it back out for you to see how it all gets put together. Shantae, can we do that?
Yeah, and actually we can take a
move up the
vote
date.
then.
Yeah,
If that's what you want. So we've agreed to move forward with the revisions. We can definitely send it back out to the group, and then I'll ask for a second consensus by email.
Okay. Does that make everybody happy?
Yes.
Sounds good.
And you just won't be able to relitigate anything in particular. So have a happy workaround versus relitigation. Okay.
Sounds great.
All right. Thank you all. Shantae, yours.
Yeah, if there are any other further questions from the panel?
So in terms of getting revisions back to you, I think the last draft we had the 24th of June, I think. What I'm planning to do is send back to you a copy with track changes and give you that to work
That will
from.
be acceptable, and I'll include
Okay.
some instructions by email on the best
Okay,
way
that'd be
to
great.
communicate your revisions. Okay.
Excellent.
And we can do that in the Word version you sent around today,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, my preference would be actually if you did it in the Word version, it makes it easier
Yeah.
for me
Mine
to
too.
Yeah.
just accept or,
Yeah.
whatever, send you a quick email if I need clarification on something. Okay?
Sounds
Sounds
good.
good.
Perfect. Just one note for the public, we did receive an additional written comment that was shared with the panel. We will be making that available to the public and placing that on our website so that everyone has access to that. And if there are no further questions, thank you all again for your participation. To the public, thank you for listening in. And I will officially close this meeting. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Spencer.
you.
Thank you, Shante.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye, everyone.
everybody on the panel.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, William.
Hey, no problem. Thank you. It was good.
Yeah. I think if I saw correctly, we were up to 30.